scenario that jobs are not under threat, because a little bit earlier on we were talking about those jobs figures, and 83,000 was the number that we gave you as the number of the day. Well, more on that. I'm now joined by Miyelani Maluleke, who's an economist at ABSA. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
So 31,000 jobs during September, 83,000 for the same period to 2016. What is that telling us?
I think it's telling us quite a number of things. The most important being that we're not growing fast enough to create employment in this country. I think everybody agrees that we need faster job growth, but the reality is that at the moment we're not generating the kind of economic growth that is sufficient to deliver those jobs for us.
All right, so some people will say, hang on, we were in recession not so long ago.
Yep.
We've turned that around, and there's even been a revision in forecasts in terms of where we're going to end the year.
Right.
And they're saying it's going to be a little bit better than we had feared. Not great, but better. How is it then that the jobs figures are going in the other way?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So we fell into the recession fourth quarter of last year, first quarter of this year, rebound in the second quarter, sustained improvement in the third quarter. But when you look under the hood, so underneath that 2.8 growth that we had in the second quarter and the 2.0% that we had in Q3, you realize that the nature of that growth was actually not broad-based. A very big part of it was actually coming from the agricultural sector and to some extent the mining sector. Across the rest of the economy, what we're seeing is continued underperformance. So I think what is being reflected here in this particular survey that we're looking at, which only measures formal sector employment, is the fact that what you're seeing in agriculture is actually not feeding through to this. But also a second important point is that you're right, there is a lag effect between when you see a pickup in economic activity and when employers feel sufficient confidence to actually begin increasing their jobs numbers.
So who's hardest hit with these jobs being shed, and why them?
So the hardest hit, interestingly, was community services, which largely is actually the public sector. And for me, the key thing that I think we're learning from this is that the fiscal restraint that we're now in here in South Africa is beginning to have an impact on employment creation in the public sector. So in government, I think the job losses on aggregate was close to 10,000. But the worrying thing for me is that even when you look outside of that, there was only one sector that actually managed to create jobs. You look across manufacturing, you look at mining, business services, all of those were down, and only construction managed to create just 4,000 jobs. So while it is a public sector that was hardest hit, the job loss is certainly broad-based across the economy.
All right, so let's, I suppose we need a fuller picture, because certainly in a developing economy such as ours, and particularly on the continent, the informal sector actually ends up absorbing a lot of these people. So we might measure formal sector and unemployment, but there's a lot of activity taking place in the informal sector. How does the story change if we bring in the informal sector into this conversation?
Absolutely. So Stats SA conducts two labor market surveys. The one that we're talking about today is the quarterly employment statistics, and it looks specifically at formal sector jobs. There is also the quarterly labor force survey, which looks at the formal sector, but together with the informal sector as well as agriculture. And when you look at that, the picture is slightly different. And I remember in the third quarter, for instance, in that survey, there was a little bit of a pickup in employment, which kind of gives you a sense that maybe activity in the informal sector, and which is stuff that we don't really measure very well, may be a little bit better than what is happening in the formal sector. But I think over time, you do need your formal sector, which is the largest part of cost, to be a lot stronger for sustained employment creation.
Do we have any idea just how big the informal sector is? Because, you know, I drive around sometimes in the township on a Sunday, and there's people informally cleaning cars as an occupation. And I'm sure they're not being measured by anybody. Yeah,
it's a good point. And I think another growing part of this informal sector is the so-called gig economy. I don't think that there's a really good way of actually measuring fully what is taking place in that part. But what I always say is that the informal sector does not exist in isolation. It's in a sense linked to the formal sector. So even if you're washing cars in a township, you probably have to buy some material to do that. You source that stuff from the formal sector. So if it really was true that activity in the informal sector is booming, I think we should be seeing some spillover effects to the rest of the economy.
Okay, so we've run out of time, but very briefly, when can we start to see a turnaround in terms of job creation?
I think, look, we're a little bit optimistic about growth next year, given the fact that global environment is certainly quite supportive. But the reality is that we're also going to need a bit of a pickup in confidence, and certainly something that you don't have in the private sector right now. Bottom line, we need faster growth to be able to make a meaningful impact to South Africa's poor employment picture.
All right, so Miyelani Maluleke, thank you very much indeed for your insights today on a very sort of sobering statistic on the unemployment levels in this country. Thanks so much for your thoughts.
Pleasure.